Hey grade 10s, welcome back to this week's lesson. This is online lesson 6. Before we begin, a little bit of review from last class. We were looking at the effects that the arrival of Europeans had on indigenous people's way of life. So I want you to go back and look at what effect did it have on their way of life through clothing, where they lived, their food source, and how Canada was maybe benefiting from placing Indigenous people on reserves. So if you need to, go back to your last lesson and take a look at that. The theme of today's lesson is a heavy one. We're going to be talking about residential schools. Now, often students, when they hear residential schools, they go, "Oh, not again. I've heard it so many times." And I understand where you're coming from. I know that students have learned a lot about this. We want to look back, though. It's important that we really understand this history, guys. It's a very painful history for a lot of people, and residential schools still affects a lot of people today, and it affects students that we have at Ross Shep here today because the impacts have continued. So what I would ask is that you just open up your heart to listen and learn and to appreciate some of the things we're going to be talking about today. I know some of them are going to be a little heavy and might create some emotion, and that's okay. And if you get uncomfortable, you can pause, you can take a breather, you can, take a little break and then come back. But it's important that we talk about it. Your learning goals. I want you to examine the consequences of the residential school system in Canada, meaning I want you to know what effect this actually had on people moving forward. And analyze, so was it good, bad, how did it affect people? How did the Indian Act affect Indigenous peoples in Canada? Those are our learning goals for today. A legacy. Residential schools is a legacy. Now, a legacy is something that is left behind from the past, or it's passed on like a baton. A legacy could be money that maybe a grandparent has left you, or you've inherited, an heirloom. Could be an old chair. It could be a vase. It could be even just a photo album. But a legacy also could be a situation or a living condition. So, for example, if your parents have made a lot of money, you might be living in a very wealthy home, and you're very lucky. If your family members have suffered from some other circumstances, maybe that means you're living in a situation that you didn't have control over. So things can get passed down. A legacy could be language. Our ancestors learn a language and therefore they pass it on. So I want you to think of some examples of how does your past or your family's past influence who you are today and how you live. An example of a legacy in government would be something called the Indian Act, signed in 1876. The Canadian government passed a law called the Indian Act. And this law meant that the Canadian government was in charge of all Indians. I'm using that word because that's what they called them in law back then. They were in charge of where they lived, their food, their education, everything. Once they placed them on reserves and had signed treaties, it basically made the Canadian government like their parents in charge of them. This meant it did not allow tribes to govern themselves. They weren't allowed to make their own decisions. They were not allowed to own their own land or even the houses on reserve. So if you had a house on a reserve, you did not get to own it. If a First Nation woman married someone who was not an Indian, you lost your support from the government and you would no longer get your treaty supports or money. So it was kind of like treating them like children. It was under this act that they created the residential school system. Residential schools are boarding schools that all First Nations and Métis children had to attend. It was mandatory. The goal was to assimilate First Nations and Métis people into Canadian society, meaning make them more like other Canadians, meaning like white Canadians. You can see them sitting in rows here, short hair, very strict, and it wouldn't have been the most exciting school. There were over 100 schools across Canada. Most of them were in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba in the west here. And the last school actually closed in 1996. So there are many children who went to residential schools who would be the same age as me today who went to those schools. So it's not that long ago that they closed. I want you to imagine what it might have been like to arrive at a residential school for the first time. This video clip here shows what a young Indigenous boy might have been going through arriving at a residential school. And I want you to imagine, how would you have felt in this situation? Students were not allowed to speak their traditional languages. They weren't allowed to practice their religion. They were forced to speak English. They were forced to adopt Christianity. They had to cut their long hair. They had to get rid of their tribal clothing. They had to become almost like a white person, although that wasn't their culture. Is this an example of Eurocentrism, believing that your way is the proper way to live? Watch this clip here for some of the effects it had on people. The impacts of residential schools were enormous. Many students experienced physical and sexual abuse at these schools. There weren't a lot of people keeping tabs on these schools, so a lot of what happened was kept in secret. Many survivors, once they got out of school at, say, age 16, went on to abuse alcohol and drugs, because that's a lot of times what people do when they're dealing with trauma or horrible feelings. They want to mask those feelings by using alcohol and drugs. If you go to this website, wherearethechildren.ca, you will click on the top part that says stories. I'd like you to actually hear from the people that were survivors. Don't listen to me. I didn't go there, and I didn't experience this. I want you to hear from people that did experience it. Once you go to these stories, you're going to find somebody, okay? And then in your assignment, I want you to share a little bit about their story and what you learned from them. As mentioned, the point of these schools was to assimilate the Indigenous people. That meant they were forced to adopt a new way of life and they forget their own culture. So young Indigenous children were never taught how to hunt or fish, how to drum, how to listen to the forest and the animals. They weren't taught the myths and the legends of their people. They weren't taught all of the things that their parents and their grandparents would have been taught. They never learned to speak their ancestors' language. You can see in this picture here how the same boy, when he arrived at residential schools versus maybe a year or two later, the change in what they're doing to their culture. They're trying to destroy the culture. It was called kill the Indian in the child, which meant kill their culture. So what can we do moving forward? I know a lot of times I hear Canadians say, well, that was a long time ago. Get over it. But the problem with that is so many of these problems still exist today. And we still are dealing with a lot of these issues. I really like this video here. You can listen to ways in which we can help by mostly just listening to the stories, listening to what Indigenous people went through, okay? So that we can start to get a better understanding. Here are some legacies of residential schools. These are pretty serious, I know, but it kind of sums up the reality. Read these and you will use these to help respond to your questions. Now, a lot of the people that survived residential schools, imagine when they got out, they didn't know how to be good parents. They didn't know how to take care of their children. They were beaten and abused. And people that are often beaten and abused, that's what they pass on to, that's what they do themselves. So a lot of these people have continued to have what's called cycles of trauma. So if your parents abuse alcohol and abuse you, then you are going to abuse alcohol and abuse your children. And it just gets passed down. And it is very hard to get rid of these problems. But what I want you guys to think about is you are special because you are part of a young group of Canadians who can continue to help spread the message of love and peace and understanding. You guys are part of a group that is really learning to end racism and to listen to the voices of Indigenous people and to listen to the voices of people of color whose family members might have experienced slavery. It's up to us and it's up to you to pass on these messages. So you're very important and we need you moving forward in Canada. So your online lesson 6 chapter questions are here. Okay, I've given you slide numbers. I've also asked you to read a little bit of this article here. Okay, and it will give you the website that you need to go to in order to find the stories. Okay, I want you to analyze some of the photographs here that I went over in the video. Okay, and I also want you to rate what effect do you think residential schools continues to have on people today, and provide reasons based off of what you learned in the videos, the slides, and my video. Thanks so much, guys. I know you can do a great job. I look forward to seeing you at our next online lesson. Take care.